All right, so there were some issues with the stream label. I don't give a fuck when I upload it to YouTube. Um, it's going to have the label that I want it to have. But yeah, it's BRG tonight, and tonight we are going to be talking about the Vietnam War. The Vietnam War is a topic that has been done to death by leftists because, in many ways, it developed the tactics and strategies that a lot of us use, like the resistance movement to the Vietnam War, developed a lot of the strategies and tactics and thinking about anti-imperialism that we continue to abide by today. So, very good book by a black journalist named Wallace Terry. He interviewed black troops who were in Vietnam, and um, he talks about like the fact that like Vietnam within the American armed forces was basically like it had all of the characteristics in many aspects of a racial conflict. Like after MLK got killed, you had dudes um, fighting each other. Like you had dudes with Black Power slogans written on their helmet covers, and you had dudes with Confederate flags who were literal Klan members. So this was not a very well organized, disciplined army. An army in which troops routinely put out bounties on and murder their commanding officers. It's not a very well run war. There was corruption out the ass. There was all sorts of stuff going on over there. And America lost for a myriad of reasons, not just because it was fighting a war with poorly trained draftees that did not want to be there, but because it was fighting an unjust war. Communists divide wars into two categories. You have just wars, such as the Palestinian People's Righteous War of Liberation against Israeli colonialism and imperialism. And you have unjust wars, such as the war that Israel is conducting against the entire Palestinian people right now and since 1948. So, brief excerpt. This was an interview with an American soldier who was black, and he said, I think blacks get along better with the Vietnamese people because they know the hardships the Vietnamese went through. The majority of the people who came over there looked down on the Vietnamese. They considered them ragged, poor, and stupid. They just didn't respect them. I can understand poverty. I had five brothers and three sisters. My mother still works, in an old people's home, an attendant changing beds and stuff. My father works in a garage in New York. They are separated, and I had to leave school after the eighth grade to work in North Carolina. Anything blacks got from the Vietnamese, we would pay for. You hardly did find a black cursing out a Vietnamese person, and a black person would try to learn some of the words and try to learn a few of their customs so they wouldn't hurt or offend them. For instance, when you meet a Vietnamese person, you're not supposed to reach out and shake his hands. You were supposed to clap your hands together, put them in front of you, and bow. And another thing, you're not supposed to talk to a girl. If you want to, you talk to her mother first, and you cannot hold her hand in public. If you see two Vietnamese men holding hands in public, that's considered friendship. That was their custom. But Americans had a different idea. If nobody talked to them first, nobody meaning a racist white person, a Vietnamese would warm right up to a black person even if he had never seen one. I remember I was in the 94th evac hospital in Long Bean, and this Montagnard girl, about 13, had been shot. Her jaw was broken. She didn't speak. She started crying. The first person she grabbed was me. She wouldn't let anybody feed her but me. I sat with her all night holding her hand. Believe me, it surprised me. I took care of her for 4 days. So, again, Wallace Terry, Bloods. Really good book if you are interested in on the ground journalism and research from a black journalist who was relatively progressive. So, these are black Marine veterans in Asia. This interview series was conducted in 1970 when the war was still in relatively full swing. So, let's see what they have to say. So, Bloods already told us that when you it demonstrates how black soldiers were received by the Vietnamese and how they received the Vietnamese. So let's just get some more background. I will be right back.
Or else the riot squad is going to come and they want to know, this happened before. We got names, we got places too, it's all official, we know. but the people in the States don't know, see. And the way we see it is that they get us over here away from home, and they'll misuse us because we can't get back home. On this rock, we can't do nothing. Tell them about it.
Shout out to Shiki. When we first got here on the rock, we all broke out in our dashiki. Spent our money for them, paid for them, all this good stuff. And when they saw so many brothers styling their dashikis, they decided, well, boom, we ought to put a stop to this. We put them where they can't wear their dashikis without a collar to it. And so boom, as being black as we are, we don't want to style our Afro clothes with no collar because it don't belong. You know, it's not supposed to be a collar to it.
Yeah, and look here. The point to that is we know black culture, you know. We are the black people. So how is somebody going to tell us how we supposed to sport our clothes, you know? This is what we're talking about. They don't want us to get a power here. It's nothing but a greeting. That's all. We can't wear our bracelets in the movie. How come? How come? It's illegal, they say. It's against regulation. They come down hard.
We have to.
All right, if you don't take it off before you come in the theater, you don't get in the theater. You know, this is the way they do this thing. They said the Afro was legal. Am I right or wrong?
That's right.
That's what they said, it was legal. We can sport an Afro. All right, this man, there's a lot of brothers here. This man here has got an Afro. This is an Afro right here. Or somewhat of an Afro. It's not big, no. But they want us to wear skin head, what they call it, high and tight. High and tight. It's not my culture. Am I right or wrong? They come over here, they get, all right, a Vietnamese girl. She called me a nigger. A nigger, a Vietnamese girl. I know it's not part of their language. Can't nobody tell me it's part of their language. But I'm going to go over here. The beast, you know that. See, we go over here, we fight. Okay, we fight to defend the water we drink, the land we grow our food on, and our way of culture. We also fight to protect Rockefeller's foundation. We fight to protect J.P. Kennedy's foundation, all these different kind of foundations that the black man can't partake of, you understand? And then we go back, we're continuously harassed. It's not necessary. This ain't what we heard, this is what we know. See, we've seen it from the bird's eye point of view. We are the people here now, see? We see it now. This ain't what we heard, you know.
Also, I know y'all haven't been out in the Ville. Now, just like you said, these Oriental people don't know how to where the word nigga came from or nothing. They have to learn how to speak it. You go out there in that Ville. The first time I come over here, I goes out in the Ville, I falls into one of these places, and I'm thrown out because I'm black, you know? Because I'm black. They don't like us. They say, we start trouble. Now who done put this stuff in their mind? You know what I mean? The beasts came over here and brainwashed these people. We get out here and try to do our thing, and they want to downrate us.
Right on.
Because we're black. Because the beasts came over here and told them that we ain't nothing but trouble. Right. Because we got a strong rapper and they scared we're going to take the women away.
Well, wait a minute. Let me tell you something about down south. Let's say down high in July this year right here, when the so-called the beasts, this is what we call them because they act savage and barbarous like animals. They pull M16s on us. We had a USO show on the 4th of July, okay? The people, it was a soul show, people might say, because most of the songs were black, okay? Because of this, coming from the club where they had the USO show at, we come in contact with all these beasts with M16 rifles and whatnot, pointing at us, threatening to kill us. All right, well, this was reported to the proper authorities. The officer today, he didn't do anything. What did he say? Go hit the rack. A man that was in the opposing group, he threw a jar of cheese at the major. Nothing was done about that. But then again, when some of the brothers went and got their guns, you know, was going to get their smoke poles and use them. This is self-defense. Everybody come down on it. If I ever hear you going lock and loading your weapon again, you going, I'm going to lock you up. You'll be in jail from now. This kind of thing. You know, some more brothers know some more incidents. We don't get a bad shit. All right, what I say now might even incriminate me because what they'll hear, what they'll recheck about what's been said on this program or whatever it is, you know. Okay, it's all going to come back. It's all going to come back. Okay. All right, the brothers, if they resist, let's say I want everybody to have haircuts. This is what the CEO or somebody said. Saturday we will have haircuts. Come haircut time, if the brothers go out and line up their fro real nice, it's looking good, it's neat, and it's presentable. This is all that's necessary. But it's not by Marine Corps regulation, which when the regulation was written, it's not by Marine Corps regulation. We want it, man. The regulation was and anyway. See, this is what we feel about it. And anyway. See, this is what we feel about it. And anyway. See, this is what we feel about it. And anyway. See, this is what we feel about it. They be moving to get things together. But why should I wait for them to move to get something together for something that I should already rate? See, this is the way we feel about it.
We've been stripped of our culture.
Sorry about that brief echo, but I was trying to fix the title of the stream because Streamlabs won't let me do it. Anyway, so yeah, if you just got here, all three of you, I'm talking about how working class draftees, regular ass troops, ruined Vietnam for the working class ruined Vietnam for the ruling class rather by simply refusing and in many cases engaging in open rebellion against the wishes and commands of rich officers and other assholes who had the desire to subjugate the Vietnamese people. As we all know, the Vietnamese people won their war of national liberation and won the war against American imperialism and Southern flunkyism, I guess you could describe it. So what you've been watching is an interview with several rebellious Black Marine veterans who were basically talking about how they were treated like shit in Vietnam, despite them having to do the most dangerous, fucked up jobs. They were still treated like shit. Like you literally had people wearing Ku Klux Klan regalia and waving Confederate flags around, but Black troops were punished for expressing solidarity with the Black Panther Party and the uprisings that were taking place back home in the communities from which they came.
And they don't want us to pick it back up. See, they tell us for all these years.
What we really belongs to us, our cultures, our heritage, they don't want us to regain it.
Look here, a brother don't worry, because if one brother ain't got, then ain't none of the brothers got.
Right.
If one of them is got, then all of them is got. This is the way it's been and this is the way it's going to be. So if one of us ain't got freedom, ain't none of us got freedom.
Cosa Four Corners, a 1 square mile section of the northern tip of Okinawa that is strictly a black thing.
There's still very heavy U.S. military presence in Okinawa. Okinawa has been doubly colonized. It's been colonized by the Americans, of course, and it's also been colonized by the Japanese. The Okinawan people have been waging a very valiant struggle against the presence of American troops on their island because, in case you didn't know, the United States military is the largest polluter on the face of the earth. And American troops, they do the same thing in Korea, have a very nasty habit of treating the local people like shit, abusing local women, doing all sorts of other horrible, terrible things. And as a result, the people rise in righteous outrage against these horrible things. So shit hasn't changed really.
No white GI and country western music, just black soul.
It says "Burn, baby, burn." That was a very, very popular slogan. It came out of the Watts uprising in 1965. A black radio DJ actually developed it. So that was a very, very popular slogan during the era of mass uprisings. Like in the 60s, they had an uprising in several urban areas every year, usually after the police did something horrible to a black person.
Every black man, send him off to Vietnam, he can go out there and fight, get shot at, but yet and still he come back to the state and he can't buy a house in Cicero, Chicago somewhere, you know what I mean? So what's the point? You know, what's the point of going?
We actually talked about Cicero the other night with the comrade from Chicago. There was a major race riot there in 1951. Basically 4,000 white people surrounded an apartment building and basically trashed it because a single black family moved in. And Cicero is currently, I believe, 89% Latino heritage. So the demographics have kind of flipped. People who are familiar with mob history also know that that's where Al Capone set up shop for a while in the 20s when he was at his peak, before he went insane from syphilis and got arrested for trying to dodge his tax obligations and ended up at Alcatraz. So Cicero has a pretty nasty rep. Martin Luther King actually was more frightened in Chicago, the supposedly progressive, democratic, liberal North, than he ever was in Mississippi or Albany, Georgia, or any of these other places that are burned into our national memory as being places that are horrible for black people. As Malcolm X said, as long as you're south of the Canadian border, you're south. And even if you're north of the Canadian border, many of our indigenous comrades will say that Canada really ain't shit but Mississippi with a funny accent.
As far as on Okinawa here, I don't think they really tried to cater to the black man. It's really, and it's hard to get something for yourself in the military because it's geared for dissent. You know, if you dissent, you lose. You know, either fall in line or you die. Okay, so you almost have to accept the way it is. And if you try to bring about a change, you best know what you're doing because they will mess you around. You'll be facing a court martial before you can know it. You know.
What happened was they were having country and western on every Saturday, and it wasn't having any soul at all in the Army clubs. So I think it was a mutual feeling among all black people in the United States Army and the medical center. That why the fuck should we have to put up with a country and western night without having any soul at all? So we decided to attend, you know, country and western one night.
Culture is a battlefield.
And we did, and what this brought on was MP cars and chaos and arresting and checking for your pass and checking for your qualifications and so forth to be in the club. If things of this nature go, it's our club too. And why the hell should anybody come around and see us?
So yeah, basically black troops are treated like shit. Hence, black troops being the basis of much of the rebellion during the Vietnam War. So I have this article. It says, the Vietnam War was a time of significant racial tension and injustice for black American soldiers in the U.S. military. Black Americans certainly had good reasons to oppose the war in Vietnam. From the outset, the burden of the war was borne disproportionately by black Americans and poor white Americans. During the early years of the war, college students could defer from military service. This was beneficial for richer young men who could afford to go to university. In 1967, 64% of all eligible black American men were drafted, but only 31% of eligible white men, a clear indicator of how rules were designed for the benefit of one racial group over another. Black Americans were also underrepresented in the officer corps, making up less than 2% of officer-ranked servicemen in 1962 and just 2.3% 10 years later in 1972. It is also important to acknowledge the fact that black Americans represented 10.6% of the entire military between 61 and 66, with 12.6% in the Army, 5.4% in the Navy, 10.3% in the Air Force, and 8% in the Marines. An interview of black American soldiers in Vietnam in 1968 found that around 80 to 85% of them expressed negative feelings about the war and the military's treatment of black Americans. Black Americans also faced disproportionate punishment during the Vietnam War, with the 1972 Department of Defense study cited by the New York Times finding that they received 25.5% of non-judicial punishments and 34.3% of court-martial punishments. They're also overrepresented in military prisons, such as Long Beach Jail, where they made up 58% of prisoners in 1969. So, Long Beach Jail. Why is Long Beach Jail so important? Because there was an uprising. Yeah, a major uprising in LBJ. That's what they called it. Because like people just didn't want to take this shit anymore. Like only 2% of the officer corps is black, but double-digit numbers in almost every branch of the service. Yeah, that's slavery. So they talk about this guy, Jimmy Childress, who served months of fierce combat. He ended up getting disillusioned with the war and decided to quit fighting. He disappeared from his unit with a group of other black soldiers and lived for months underground, staying with Vietnamese peasants in the countryside and hiding out in Saigon's Soul Alley, a neighborhood where many black GIs congregated in their off hours. During that time, I was stealing from the military M16s, grenade launchers, and he even stole a couple of Jeeps. He then sold these items on the black market to make money. Eventually, he was caught and sent to the Army's notorious Long Beach Jail, LBJ for short, on the outskirts of Saigon. This military stockade, held American soldiers who were serving short sentences before being sent back to the field, as well as soldiers who had been convicted of serious crimes who were waiting to be sent to jail in the United States. The reason soldiers were at LBJ varied greatly. Some were there for serious crimes like murder. Others were there for small infractions, such as refusing a direct order to get a haircut. By the summer of '68, over half of the prisoners in this stockade, this military prison, were being held on absent without leave, AWOL charges. Originally built to house 400 inmates, in August of '68, LBJ was crammed with 719 men. And in a mirror of the U.S. justice system, black troops were greatly overrepresented in the jail. Despite representing only 11% of the troops in Vietnam, more than 50% of the men incarcerated in this jail were black. Many black soldiers felt that they were more severely punished than white soldiers for similar offenses. Here you are in a war zone, in a jail, at their mercy, remembers Scott Riley, another black soldier who was sent to the stockade after getting caught with a whole lot of marijuana. As LBJ grew more crowded, tensions along racial lines deepened. Black and white being in Vietnam was no different than black and white being in America, said Childress. Richard Perdomo, a white inmate, remembers stark self-segregation among the inmate population. We weren't separated by the military. We were separated by the want to be separated. Simultaneously, news was trickling into the prison about the turbulent events in '68 in the United States. The assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. was a turning point for many black soldiers in Vietnam. If you watch The Five Bloods, Spike Lee's latest film, if I recall correctly, it follows a group of black soldiers who engaged in various types of struggle after MLK was killed in response to the abysmal treatment that black troops received in Vietnam. A new burst of anger was afoot in the prison. Jimmy Childress says, "Why am I even over here? When you can't even go back to America and sit at a lunch counter, you know?" He and other black soldiers felt that their real fight was in America, not in Vietnam. Frustrated about being in Vietnam and angry about the treatment at the stockade, Childress and many other black soldiers in the prison had reached a breaking point. We were hot and crazy. We were fed up, so we decided we're going to tear this motherfucker down. And to tear it down they did. Close to midnight on August 29th, a group of inmates overpowered the guards and with homemade weapons and bare hands started tearing down the stockade. Childress set his sights on the administrative building, where all the records of the incarcerated soldiers were kept. He and a few other inmates kicked the door in and started lighting papers on fire. "I figured the records were the key to causing more confusion for the military," he said. Out of nowhere, this black guy opens the door and says, "Come on out, man." The man then handed Riley a piece of cake that had been liberated from the kitchen. The euphoria of being free. That moment was a beautiful moment, knowing all the while that this is not going to end well. Meanwhile, the guards at the stockade were terrified. Everything just sped up in fast motion. I saw 6 to 8 prisoners running towards me. They threw me to the ground, started kicking and pummeled me with fists, said Larry Kimbrough, who was an MP on duty that night. The deputy commander, the highest ranking officer at the stockade, entered the melee to try to defuse the riot. I was surrounded by about 100 inmates. I think I talked to them for a good 15 to 20 minutes, but then I heard 2 or 3 of them saying, "You ought to kill the Uncle Tom." They stopped listening to me to what I was saying, so they left. They opened the gate for me and let me out. They also burned down the mess hall building, as you see here. By the early morning hours of August 30th, 65 soldiers were hurt, and 1 white inmate had been killed, Edward O'Day Haskett. He was struck in the head with a shovel by a black inmate. Much of the stockade had been torn down, including 7 buildings and 19 tents. The stockade commander, Vernon D. Johnson, had been severely beaten. 3 weeks after the riot popped off, the military revealed to reporters that 12 black soldiers still controlled a section of the stockade. The military was literally throwing boxes of sea rations over the fence for us to eat, so we knew that they weren't going to kill us. People started pulling out drugs from God only knows where, and we're literally laying in the yard in the hot sun getting high. So yeah, that's what popped off in LBJ. Like, these were supposed to be the fucking worst of the worst, but like, why were they the worst of the worst? Because America and the military made them that way. Speaking of drugs, that was a big thing too. A very large chunk of American troops came back from Vietnam grievously addicted to heroin. So this is a New York Times article from May 16th of 71. And this is a military official who was quoted as saying, "Tens of thousands of soldiers are going back as walking time bombs. And the sad thing is there's no real problem underway, despite what my superiors say, to salvage these guys." The figures on heroin users most often heard here is about 10 to 15% of the lower ranking enlisted men. Since they make up about 245,000 of the 277,000 American soldiers here, this would represent as many as 37,000 men. Some officers working in the drug suppression field, however, say that their estimates go as high as 25% or more than 60,000 enlisted men, most of whom are draftees. They say that some field surveys have reported units with more than 50% of the men on heroin. The death toll from heroin overdose is expected to rise this year as well, despite the reduction in American troops. 35 soldiers died from ODs in the first 3 months of this year. Last year, the quarterly average was 26, for a total of 103. Through March of 71, a total of 1,084 servicemen were charged with heroin use or possession against 1,146 in all of 1970. In 1969, before heroin's widespread use here, there were 250 arrests. In explaining why so many soldiers have turned to heroin, Major Richard Ratner, a psychiatrist from the Bronx working at a rehabilitation center called Crossroads at Long Bean, the sprawling American support base near Saigon, said the men were reacting to Vietnam much like the deprived in a ghetto. Vietnam, in many ways, is a ghetto for the enlisted man, he said. The soldiers don't want to be here. The living conditions are bad. They are surrounded by privileged classes, namely officers. There is accepted use of violence. These are soldiers. And there is promiscuous sex. They react the way they do in a ghetto. They take drugs and try to forget. What most of the men say when they come in the center is that they took the heroin because of boredom and hassle of life here. So, yeah, it was wild. There are even conspiracy theories going around saying that the Viet Cong, the proper name is the National Liberation Front, was purposefully selling heroin to American troops so that their fighting efficacy would be affected, and because you can't fight a war with an army of people who are addicted to heroin. So, in the United States, heroin of about 5% purity is injected either by smoking or sniffing. Soldiers in Vietnam became addicted to heroin of about 95% strength because you're right by where they grow and produce this stuff at. Like, it's right by the Golden Triangle, Laos, Cambodia, Vietnam. Like that's where they grow all that stuff at. Thailand. Like they grow that stuff and they process it there. And as a matter of fact, the French Secret Service was actively engaged along with Corsican narcotics traffickers and the fucking mafia the mafia was in Vietnam. They came to Vietnam with the American troops. Like one of the families literally sent a dude to Vietnam to rip off the military. So you have all of these fucking organized criminals there selling drugs to American troops. And yeah, so if you watch American Gangster, a lot of that shit was real. You also had remnants of the Kuomintang, the people that the Chinese Communist Party and its People's Liberation Army had ran out of China. So they couldn't operate in China anymore. So they hung out and trafficked dope. Like you literally had warlord armies operating in Burma, aka Myanmar, Thailand, Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, like all these areas where just riddled with warlord armies. Thoughts on Full Metal Jacket? I like it. It's a good film. So yeah, you had drugs, you had race riots, you had all sorts of shit going on. This is a Times article. It talks about the Five Bloods. And you have basically more black Vietnam vets talking about the real injustices that they faced during the war. So, as the fighting dragged on, ugly statistics revealed how African Americans were being disproportionately affected by the war. Robert McNamara's Project 100,000, implemented in '66, pulled hundreds of thousands of poor men into the war, 40% of them African Americans. By the following year, black soldiers made up 16.3% of those drafted and 23% of Vietnam combat troops, despite accounting for only roughly 11% of the civilian population. In 1969, Time magazine correspondent Wallace Terry, author of this very good book, Bloods, conducted a survey of 400 black soldiers on the ground and found that 60% of them believed that black people should not fight in Vietnam because of inequality in the U.S. Terry quoted one soldier saying, "Why should I come over here when some of the South Vietnamese live better than my people? We have enough problems dealing with white people back home." At one point, this is Janice Terry Wallace's wife, he says that he felt his life was in danger because of this. Janice would often visit her husband in army camps and remember seeing Confederate flags strewn from barracks and trucks. "You're in a war and some idiots are flying a Confederate flag," she says. That made black soldiers so angry. So, yeah, it was wild. Like, you cannot fight a war like this. You cannot fight a war like that. Because thing is, first of all, you've got two issues going on. For one, it's an unjust war. Okay? Like, these people are not stupid. These people that you're sitting over there, either they don't know what the fuck they're fighting for, you tell them bullshit about fighting the communists, and they get over there, like, well, what the fuck is communism? Like, why am I here? If these people want to be communists, then let them be communists. Like, Americans, especially black troops, realize that I'm over here fighting what they call a white man's war, because it was a white man's war. And you're telling us we're trying to liberate these people. These people want us out. Okay? Like, as the brother in Blood said, like, these people want us out of here. Because black troops had sort of a natural affinity for the Vietnamese as a people of color, who were being oppressed by American imperialism, violent American imperialism. So black troops had a rapport with Vietnamese people because like they were struggling. They were fighting basically the same fight that we were fighting. Like, half these white troops had fucking Confederate flags. They were throwing them all over the trucks and stuff. It was fucking horrible. So, of course, they're not going to be gung-ho for this stupid-ass war. Let me try to find an example of how white troops treated the Vietnamese. I have a bunch of stuff dog-eared in this book. But yeah, you should get this. It's a really good book. But basically, there's one account in here. I should have dog-eared it before I did this stream, but I just got off work. Shoot me. Anyways, so one black troop talks about like how white soldiers would just get into trucks and run over Vietnamese people. How they would chuck sea ration cans and hit these little kids in the head, splitting their heads open. How they would rape the Vietnamese women. All of these horrible things. And black people definitely took part in atrocities too, but not to the extent like the white soldiers over there for the most part, and many of them were rebels as well. But like they considered that I'm the conqueror. I'm here to, I can do whatever the fuck I want to these people. So there's a whole like book about GI resistance. It's called Vietnam Generation. I'm going to link it in the YouTube description of this stream. But this this pamphlet, I guess it's only 124 pages, talks about like the various ways that GIs resisted during the Vietnamese occupation war. So the war within a war, descent in the Vietnam era military. Zoom in a little bit. So you basically had the military fighting itself. Beginning in the latter part of the 1960s, an unprecedented movement of soldier dissent gathered momentum. Originating primarily as an anti-war movement, it escalated to a point where it was a force waging a battle against military authority and legitimacy. While desertions, AWOLs, drug use, and even fraggings have long plagued the United States military, organized resistance appears to be a uniquely Vietnam-era phenomenon. So it hadn't been seen before, it had been seen since. You had, of course, isolated cases. For example, in the Korean situation, you had like, I think it was like 12 American troops that defected to North Korea. And there's various reasons for resistance. Like, not all resistance was political, but it's still a political act. Like, some guys just didn't want to be over there because nobody likes getting shot at unless you are a psychopathic adrenaline junkie. So, but especially in the case of black troops, our rebellion was inherently political. Like, we had grown up listening to Malcolm X, Muhammad Ali saying that no Vietnamese ever called me the N-word. So you could compare that to a white hippie that's unfortunately found himself in Vietnam just sitting around smoking weed and growing his hair out long. So various types of resistance, even though all are valid, they are conducted for various reasons. So we had black people, black GIs that were over there actually drawing parallels, correct parallels between our plight here in the United States and the plight of the Vietnamese in Vietnam. Only that can only be done through political education and the ability to sum up the conditions in which you find yourself. So, officers didn't really rebel. You had the concerned officers movement, but the officers in the military, like, they're a privileged class. They have better accommodations. They have better everything. So you have class struggle within the United States military because nobody likes the fucking officers. That's why they were getting killed so often. So 68, that was probably the turning point in Vietnam. You had the Tet Offensive, where the Viet Cong, aka the National Liberation Front, stormed a shitload of American-occupied cities. And you also had a growth in these underground presses. You had papers like the Bond FTA, which stands for Fuck the Army, Vietnam GI, the Ally. And you also had coffee houses where radical servicemen could meet. You had Mad Anthony's and the UFO. You had groups such as the American Servicemen's Union and the Fuck the Army organization. And then you had GIs United Against the War in Vietnam and the Movement for a Democratic Military. And then when many of these people found themselves stateside, you ended up with groups like the Vietnam Veterans Against the War. Fun fact, Carl Dix was a Vietnam veteran. He was very active in VVA As a matter of fact, there was a substantial amount of RCP, Revolutionary Communist Party, entryism into the Vietnam Veterans Against the War, and there's still a splinter group affiliated with the RCP called Vietnam Veterans Against the War Anti-Imperialist, VVAWAI. So, a bunch of people from the 60s are still hanging around. Churches also played a major part in sheltering draft resistors, particularly Harvard Divinity School and the Episcopalian Church. There's basically an underground railroad helping people get up to Canada or Mexico or anywhere that they don't have to worry about extradition. Then we talked about stockade rebellions, such as at Long Beach Jail. They increased after 68 and brought with them increased publicity over the less than adequate conditions under which inmates who were still soldiers were forced to live. More importantly, stockade rebellions served to emphasize what a growing number of GIs were beginning to realize: the military's basic denial of any kind of rights or freedoms for enlisted individuals. So you also had GI participation in anti-war demonstrations. The largest nationwide participation of GIs was in May of 1970 in what the GIs termed Armed Forces Day. This demonstration was held in conjunction with the traditional Armed Forces Day celebrations. GIs at Fort Hood, Fort Bliss, Fort Bragg, Fort Lewis, Fort Devens, and other bases turned out to protest the war and the military. Estimates of the numbers involved range from 1,500 at Fort Bragg and 500 at Fort Hood down to 20 or 30 at Fort Devens. Black soldiers continued to step up their fight against racism. In July, 250 black GIs revolted at Fort Hood, burning 2 re-enlistment officers and a BEQ building. At Fort Carson, also during July, 200 black soldiers seized a section of the base while fighting off the military police. In Heidelberg, West Germany, 1,000 black and white GIs held a July rally against racism in the army. While these demonstrations by black military personnel were not the first signs of growing anti-racist sentiment, the expanding scope and intensity of this resistance, in conjunction with the anti-war, anti-military position of many white enlisted people, did present a formidable threat to the brass. At least the military defined it as such. So this is a pamphlet that was produced by the Vietnam Veterans Against the War Winter Soldier Organization. Not that long. It's only 18 pages. But you've got a review of a demonstration. They even had a lost and found. Very well organized. They're talking about how people found a couple of packs, a camera, a suitcase, numerous sleeping bags, coolers, clothes, etc. So they didn't steal these things. They salvaged them and took them back to the national office. Yeah, reports of a national steering committee meeting. Basic bureaucratic shit. Like all orgs basically do the same thing. They're talking about a trial of GIs that were in prison in Leavenworth. Odell Bennett, Jesse Evans, Alf Hill, and Alfred Jasper. Then you have Jesse Lopez and Armando Miramon. Like back then, they did not have the internet, so this is how people got their news. You've got political analysis here. It is the John Waynes, the Richard Nixons, the Donald Johnsons, the corporate elite who have forgotten as if they ever really cared. What has been apparent to the vast majority of veterans long before discharge is only now reaching the eyes and ears of our government. What are those vets yelling about, they cry. Are we not always explaining to them our great concern, the fantastic programs we have created for vets? They are whimpering. Bull, we shout. It's only a bunch of hot air that they've created. A distorted caricature of concern. Pure baloney. We already know what the problem is. Unemployment and sham jobs. 6% unemployment for all Americans, 10% for vets generally, and 14% for minority vets. Or these incredibly bogus job fairs so many of us have been to, where they tell us to be a janitor, or a laundry helper, or a part-time gas pumper. Or the GI Bill. Do they really expect us to swallow that line that $200 or even $260 a month will pay tuition, books, and living expenses, and also learn something at the same time? Do any of our great legislators know what it's like to lie in their own excrement for hours, or wait all day for someone to turn them over on their other side in a VA hospital? Do they know what it's like to get hooked on methadone and trade for heroin? Do they know what it's like to be branded for life by a bad discharge? We know that the vast majority of bad discharges weren't even given at court-martial. The most were issued administratively by the military to get rid of dissidents, to get rid of men and women who wouldn't submit to the racism and oppression of the military or fight against the Indochinese people. Maybe they would like a secret code, an SPC number, placed on their employment record, branding them as deviant or having unclean habits. Unclean habits in this era generally meant homosexuality. So, what were the conditions that what were the conditions? Like, why did people not want to fight in Vietnam? Let's watch a little bit of this and see why. How the Viet Cong smoked American soldiers.
These Viet Cong are elusive. You can't see them. All you can do is hear the bullets as they come at you.
So, you're in the jungle, right? You've never been in the jungle before. You're from Flint, Michigan, or Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, or Akron, Ohio. You're from a temperate climate. You've never been in the jungle. You've never seen these animals before. Like, Bloods talks about one dude who was afraid to use the toilet in Vietnam because the Viet Cong would put snakes in the toilet, or they would booby trap the toilet. Like, it was basically like a giant throne. They had an outhouse in the jungle, and you couldn't go sit on this thing because the Viet Cong would shoot at you, or you'd have to worry about getting your dick blown off in the toilet. So, not very fun. Drugs everywhere, diseases. VD has been the plague of soldiers for millennia. All sorts of shitty things happening. So you didn't want to be there, and you're walking through the jungle at like 0 dark 30. It's dark as hell, and you don't know if your next step is going to be your fucking last. So that takes a psychological toll on you.
Is an enemy which steals from us the weapons of the 20th century and supplements them with the weapons of the 16th century.
Exercise great care. Every object is a possible booby trap. Some booby traps are more alluring and ingenious than others. If you are a boob, you will be trapped.
The biggest problem in fighting the enemy in Vietnam is finding him in order to fight him.
Yeah, America has this obsession with like, come out and fight us. Okay, that's not going to work, okay? Guerrilla warfare is the best way to wear down an opponent who relies heavily on technology and supply lines and stuff like that. Like, the Viet Cong didn't do that. They, in many cases, they came from the area in which they were fighting. You cannot know an area better than somebody who was born and raised there. Not just somebody who was born and raised there, but their entire family was born and raised there over the course of 600, 700 years. So these people are intimately connected to the land. How the fuck are you going to be able to unask them from what's basically theirs? These people are one with the land. You're a foreign invader. Like, America should have taken a lesson from the French after they got their asses kicked and never went there. Or they should have talked to the Chinese, who have been fighting the Vietnamese for centuries. But America, in its arrogance, decided that it could pacify these people.
The Americans could have learned something from Vietnam. Using the conflict as a lesson, American planners could have used as precedent the futility of using such metrics as body counts and firepower, tonnage of bombs to measure.
What American troops would do to inflate their body count, they would literally go into a village, kill everybody, and then say that they had killed 25 Viet Cong. The baby, the old woman, the guy with one leg or one arm. They were all Viet Cong. Everybody was Viet Cong that they killed. Like, it was like this fucking numbers cha-cha slide. Like, just rack up the numbers. Just kill whoever you got to kill. Just drop bombs all over the place. And the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army, the North Vietnamese regulars who used the Ho Chi Minh Trail, they actually used the Americans as like a demolition service. Like, they would literally do some activity around some American troops so that the American troops would call in a bombing raid, and the bombs would come and make big-ass craters, and then the Vietnamese would use the craters and the dirt to help them expand the trail. That is the essence of guerrilla warfare, using your enemy's own weapons against them.
Success in war. Of course, even before the end of the war, American planners knew that bombing wouldn't win the war. Defense Secretary Clark Clifford admitted as much in 1969. Bombing by itself would not stop the war. We had already dropped a heavier tonnage of bombs than in all the theaters of World War II.
The Israelis should also take a lesson from this. As a matter of fact, the Israelis should take a lesson from all of this. Like, people are always talking about, like, the poor IDF. They're drafted. These are, like, kids. Okay, so, like, this is basically Israel's Vietnam moment, right? Like, Gaza is Israel's Vietnam. And Israel is going to lose in Gaza just like Americans lost in Vietnam. So I keep hearing all this talk about the Israeli left. Like, I really don't see any Israeli left. I'm like, yeah, cool. It's cool that everybody's protesting. But, like, your country is literally committing a genocide. The time for protest is over, especially if you're in the IDF. So desert. Turn the guns around. Like, if you want to be a leftist, if you want to call yourself a leftist, like, what did the leftists in South Africa do? They didn't wave signs saying that the way their country was treating black people was horrible. Anybody with eyes and ears could see that and hear that. What's needed, really, is a movement similar to that staged by the GIs in Vietnam. Actually, it has to be worse because Gaza, in many instances, is worse. Like, they've basically been camping outside of the Al-Shifa hospital, popping, shooting, killing nurses, doctors. They're shutting off the electricity. Like, all of the preemie babies are going to die. Like, if not now, when? Like, you complain about this stuff. You expect us to feel sorry for you. You expect the Palestine Solidarity Movement to basically drop everything it's doing and pay attention to this poor little herd Zionist. But, like, what are you doing? Like, what are you doing to stop this?
During 1967, an estimated 90,000 North Vietnamese had infiltrated into South Vietnam. In the opening weeks of 1960,
I love how they're talking about these people who are infiltrating into their own country. Like, if anybody was the infiltrator, it was the Americans.
Infiltrators were coming in at 3 to 4 times the rate of a year earlier, despite the ferocity and intensity of our bombing campaign. Despite this, heavy firepower continued to be the grand strategy for all future American wars, the success of which
Hey, look, another war we lost.
would vary between ambiguous and outright catastrophic. Iraq and Afghanistan are no exception.
Another war we lost.
Iraq, as I covered in my Iraq insurgency video, proved to have a boundless will to resist. And despite clobbering the country with unrelenting firepower, the Iraqis were never subdued. The Americans' goals were never met, and the Iraq fiasco proved to be a massive and costly failure. The cleverness of the Iraqis also knew no bounds, who had no army to speak of by April of 2003, no navy, no air force, no helicopters, and by arming themselves with simple assault rifles, machine guns, rockets, and mortars, and by utilizing scraps of metal and electronics, they were able to outfit themselves into a formidable force, against all the odds stacked against them. Iraq was guerrilla war, as was Vietnam. In Robert Asprey's mammoth history of guerrilla warfare, the author describes the mentality
War in the Shadows is actually an extremely good book. I got a copy from a comrade of mine on my birthday last year. Highly recommend.
That the Americans were operating from. Quote, not understanding basic tenets of guerrilla warfare, American senior officers converted fatalities into victories. This was a great mistake. Dead bodies do not mean destroyed infrastructure. Dead bodies,
especially if your enemy relies heavily on tunnels,
particularly those of innocent peasants, mean a strengthening, not a weakening, of the insurgent cause.
Dead bodies mean a strengthening, not a weakening, of the insurgent cause. Are you listening, Israel?
The colonial enemy of the Iraqis were the British. In Vietnam, the French. In their pacification campaign, the French arrested nationalist leaders and executed them via guillotine, even displaying their severed heads publicly to terrorize would-be revolutionaries. Many were imprisoned and shipped off to Kuen Dao, a prison that would be maintained through the American occupation and would come to have a brutal reputation.
Those are the cells. Like, they'll literally put you under there in like a shitload of water.
Those imprisoned at Kundao would form the early foundation of the communist revolutionary movement and included multiple future prime ministers. When the United States took over from the French in 1954, they, as had happened in Iraq nearly 50 years later, would make a series of blunderous errors that by all means created a guerrilla army that took up arms to fight them. After the French were defeated on the battlefield, a Geneva conference split Vietnam in two and created the country of South Vietnam. It is no exaggeration to say that the country of South Vietnam was a creation of the United States.
No shit. Look at them. So, to sum up, why was there rebellion? Like, why was there such fatigue and malaise among troops, especially black troops in Vietnam? I mean, you can ask the same question of any unjust war. Like, people do not want to fight wars, never mind unjust ones. I guarantee you, after all the Israeli propaganda and shit dies off, you will see similar conditions impacting IOF, Israeli Occupation Force troops. Because Gaza ain't no joke. Like, I don't know why they thought that Gaza was just going to be like a fucking pushover. But these people have been fighting for almost 80 years now. They will happily fight for 80 more because they are determined, rightfully so, to continue their existence as a people. So, nobody wants to fight an unjust war. Nobody wants to be removed from their semi-comfortable homes, people that they know, environment that they know, and dragged 10,000 miles away to go die in a fucking jungle. That's the selfishness aspect of it. Like, nobody wants to fucking die. Same reason why so many white kids in America fervently resisted the draft. Many of them came to an anti-imperialist recognition after they had been in the movement for a while. But the initial outrage was the fact that you're disrupting my college studies. You've taken away my deferment, and you're about to make me go fight a fucking war. And then through engagement with the movement and through engagement with black revolutionaries, black militants, black progressives, and black veterans of the war, these white kids who would go on to make up a pretty substantial chunk of the anti-war movement, they developed their consciousness. Because black people will tell you, like, it's not all about you, bruh. It's not all about you. Like, these people over here, little babies are being burned alive. I saw an old woman run over with a tank. Like, horrible, stupid, evil, unjust shit happening. So it takes a conscript army experiencing this stuff coupled with resistance at home to actually stop these wars. Plus the fact that the war was fucking expensive. So wasting money, people seeing their brothers and cousins and uncles and dads come home either addicted to heroin, missing arms and legs, missing a mind, or missing a life, fear of being drafted, and general racism, outrage. Like, you get called the N-word after coming back from roaming around the jungle looking for an enemy that you never see until it's time to get a pot shot taken at you. You still have a chunk of your buddy's brain in the inside of your helmet. Like, yeah, you're going to throw the fuck down too. So don't fight unjust wars. Don't start unjust wars. If you find yourself in an unjust war, turn it into a revolutionary war. I'm BRG. Tomorrow, I am going to be interviewing a very important person, Comrade Megan Romer of DSA's Red Star Caucus, who is running for a co-chair position in the National Political Council. So she wants to be the big poobah. Let's see.